4:15 in the morning. The USS John Finn, a destroyer DDG-113, was carving a slow and silent path through the deep waters of the Gulf of Oman. The ship was operating under strict emission control, but for the last 10 minutes, the electronic warfare suite had been picking up a signal that was not supposed to exist. The question for the crew was not whether they were being watched, but why the watcher had finally decided to turn on the lights. The air in the region was thick with humidity and the heavy, metallic scent of the sea, while below the flight deck, the hull hummed with the steady and rhythmic vibration of the gas turbine engines. The atmosphere inside the Combat Information Center changed the moment. The electronic warfare technician noticed a sharp spike in the S-band spectrum. The blue glow of the digital consoles illuminated faces that were suddenly very alert and focused. The air in the compartment was cool, smelling faintly of ozone and recycled oxygen, which provided a sharp contrast to the humid and salt-laden air on the weather decks above. At coordinates 24 degrees 42 minutes north, 58 degrees 12 minutes east, the destroyer was approximately 60 miles off the coast of Iran. The commanding officer, Commander Marcus Vane, stepped into the center of the room just as the first alarm chirped. It was not a loud or jarring sound, but in the focused silence of the midnight watch, it carried the weight of a physical blow to everyone present. On the massive display, screens of the Aegis weapon system, a single white dot appeared with terrifying clarity. It was not a fishing boat or a slow-moving commercial aircraft, and the system immediately flagged it as a high-priority threat. The track had originated from a known coastal defense site near the port of Jask. The thermal signature, recorded by satellite overhead, was massive and consistent with a solid-fuel rocket, motor igniting in a vertical launch. The tactical action officer announced the new track, designated Master 6014, and his voice remained steady despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. Multiple sensors confirmed a high-angle ballistic launch, and the speed of the contact was already passing Mach 2. The projected intercept point on the digital map was their current position, and the time to impact was shrinking with every second. The Khalij Fars, also known as the Persian Gulf missile, was a weapon designed specifically for a Bispan 7 moment like this. It was a supersonic, anti-ship ballistic missile, a variant of the Fateh 110, equipped with an advanced electro-optical seeker for its terminal phase. Unlike a sea-skimming cruise missile that hides behind the horizon, this was a Danbayan vertical threat that climbed high into the atmosphere. It was designed to scream down at a steep angle, using gravity and immense kinetic energy to punch through the thin deck armor of a modern surface combatant. On the bridge, the lookouts squinted into the absolute darkness of the Gulf, but there was nothing for them to see yet. The threat was still 40 miles away and 12 miles up, moving at a speed that defied human reaction times. Only the computers of the Aegis system could keep up with the incoming projectile. The ANSPY-6 radar was now radiating at full power, its phased array faces sending out pulses of energy that bounced off the incoming warhead and returned to the ship in mere milliseconds. Commander Vane watched the intercept geometry update on his primary display. The missile was accelerating as it reached the apex of its flight path and began its long arc toward the ship. It was no longer just a piece of foreign technology, but a 3,000-pound arrow aimed directly at the heart of the destroyer. He ordered the ship to set general quarters and prepared the Mark 41 vertical launch system for an immediate engagement. The ship's internal alarm, the piercing and repetitive gong of general quarters, began to echo through every passageway and sleeping compartment. Men and women who had been in a deep sleep seconds ago were now scrambling into their fire-retardant flash gear, their boots thudding against the steel decks in a frantic but disciplined rhythm. The hum of the ship changed as the engines were pushed to full power, the 4 gas turbines roaring to life to provide the massive electrical load required for the combat systems. The USS John Finn was no longer a silent observer in the dark. It was a cornered predator, its sensors locked onto the hunter with lethal intent. As the first pair of Standard Missile 6 interceptors cleared the deck in a violent blast of white flame and chemical smoke, the crew knew that the window of opportunity was closing. The Khalij Fars was already beginning its final, guided descent, its seeker searching for the heat signature of the destroyer's exhaust stacks. The engagement was no longer a theoretical exercise, but a physical reality of high-velocity physics that would be decided in the next 90 seconds. 4:20 in the morning, the Iranian coastline near the port of Jask, the mobile transporter erector launcher for the Khalij Fars missile, had been stationary for only 3 minutes. The crew on the ground worked with a frantic, rehearsed precision, their boots kicking up the fine, dry dust of the coastal scrubland. The air was heavy with the smell of unrefined diesel and the sharp alkaline scent of the salt flats. In the back of a hardened command vehicle, a technician watched a high-resolution screen, feeding data from a long-range maritime surveillance radar. The Khalij Fars, or Persian Gulf missile, was the crown jewel of the Iranian anti-access arsenal. It was a single-stage, solid-propellant anti-ship ballistic missile with an operational range of 300 kilometers, measuring nearly 9 meters in length and weighing over 3,300 kilograms. It was a massive and unforgiving instrument of war. The warhead alone was a 500-kilogram, high-explosive fragmentation charge designed to create a catastrophic overpressure event upon impact. As the hydraulic arms of the launcher reached their full extension, the missile pointed toward the black sky at an angle of 85 degrees. The technical challenge of hitting a moving target at sea with a ballistic missile was immense. Unlike a standard ballistic missile that follows a predictable parabolic arc, the Khalij Fars was equipped with an advanced active seeker in its nose cone. During the mid-course phase, the weapon relied on an internal inertial navigation system. But as it re-entered the lower atmosphere, its electro-optical sensor would activate. This sensor was programmed to look for the specific visual and thermal contrast of a large gray ship against the dark blue background of the ocean. The targeting data had been provided by a shore-based over-the-horizon radar, which had been tracking the destroyer DDG-113 for the last 40 miles. Inside the command van, the final launch sequence was initiated. The commander of the battery did not hesitate. The orders had come directly from the BAN, regional headquarters of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. A single button was pressed, completing the electrical circuit to the solid rocket motor. At exactly 4:21 in the morning, the base of the missile erupted in a violent explosion of orange flame and thick swirling white smoke. The pressure wave flattened the surrounding scrub brush and sent a cloud of grit and sand flying for 50 meters in every direction. The missile cleared the launcher in a fraction of a second, its rocket motor screaming with a deafening roar that could be heard for miles along the coast. It accelerated vertically, piercing the low-lying coastal haze and disappearing into the darkness of the upper atmosphere. Within 30 seconds, the missile had reached a speed of Mach 3, its skin heating up to hundreds of degrees due to atmospheric friction. The guidance computer began making micro-adjustments to the steering fins, refining the flight path to intercept the calculated future position of the USS John Finn. Back on the destroyer, the Aegis weapon system was already processing the launch data. The AN/SPY-6 radar was tracking the missile with extreme precision, calculating its velocity, altitude, and projected impact point. The ship's tactical action officer knew that this was not a random launch. The missile was coming with a specific and lethal purpose. The high-energy radar pulses from the destroyer were now hitting the missile, but the Khalij Fars was moving too fast for any human to intercept with manual controls. The defense of the ship now rested entirely on the speed of light and the complex algorithms of the standard missile interceptors. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex as the Iranian battery prepared a second launch. By firing multiple missiles, they hoped to saturate the destroyer's defenses, forcing the Aegis system to divide its attention and resources. On the ground, a second launcher was already moving into its firing position, its heavy tires churning through the soft sand. The air remained thick with the acrid smell of burnt propellant from the first launch, a chemical signature that lingered in the still morning air. The battle for the Gulf of Oman had moved from the realm of shadow and surveillance into a kinetic exchange of high-technology weapons, and the clock was ticking down in milliseconds. 4:21 in the morning. The USS John Finn was no longer a silent observer in the dark, but a concentrated hub of electromagnetic energy and lethal intent. Deep within the hull, the Aegis baseline 10 combat system was processing millions of data points every second, its algorithms calculating a firing solution for the incoming Master 6014. The ship's 4 gas turbine engines were screaming at full power, generating the massive electrical current required to sustain the AN/SPY-6 radar at its peak operating capacity. Inside the Combat Information Center, the air was cold and dry, smelling of ozone and the faint, metallic scent of high-end electronics under heavy load. The tactical action officer sat at his console, his eyes fixed on the blue and white vector lines that represented the predicted path of the Iranian ballistic missile. The target was currently 80,000 feet in the air and accelerating as it began its terminal dive, moving at a speed of nearly Mach 5. At this velocity, the missile was no longer just a weapon, it was a kinetic hammer, capable of obliterating anything in its path. The order to engage was given with a calm, practiced authority that masked the extreme tension of the moment. The commanding officer authorized the release of the first defensive salvo. On the forward deck, the heavy steel hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch system snapped open with a sharp mechanical clack. A split second later, a Standard Missile 6 erupted from cell number 24. The missile's rocket motor ignited with a deafening roar, punching a pillar of white flame and acrid, chemical smoke into the humid night air. The heat from the launch was so intense that it instantly vaporized the salt spray clinging to the deck, creating a momentary cloud of white steam that blotted out the bridge windows. The ship shuddered under the force of the launch. A deep, structural vibration that could be felt by every sailor from the engine room to the mast. The Standard Missile 6, or SM-6, was the most advanced interceptor in the United States Navy's inventory. It was designed to reach out and touch threats at extreme ranges and altitudes, using its own active radar seeker to find and destroy targets. As the first interceptor climbed toward the stars, a second SM-6 followed it 3 seconds later, its white exhaust trail drawing a brilliant, jagged line across the black sky. The two interceptors were racing toward a point in space 30 miles away and 60,000 feet up, where they were scheduled to collide with the Khalij Fars. The technical complexity of this engagement was staggering. The AN/SPY-6 radar was painting the incoming threat with high-energy pulses, while simultaneously providing mid-course guidance updates to the two interceptors. Every millisecond mattered. If the radar lost lock for even a heartbeat, the interceptors would go blind, and the ship would be left defenseless. Against a warhead moving at over 1,500 meters per second, the sailors in the Combat Information Center watched their screens in total silence, the only sound being the low hum of cooling fans and the occasional, clipped report of the radar technicians. As the interceptors neared the engagement zone, the SM-6 active seekers turned on, searching for the massive heat and radar signature of the descending Iranian missile. The ship's computers predicted an intercept in exactly 12 seconds. The air on the bridge was thick with the smell of burnt propellant that had been sucked in through the ventilation system, a sharp, biting odor that served as a reminder of the violence occurring just outside the steel hull. The bridge wing lookouts watched the sky, seeing the faint, glowing dots of the interceptors as they adjusted their flight paths with violent, high-G maneuvers. Suddenly, a new variable appeared on the tactical display. The Khalij Fars was not following a simple ballistic arc. Its internal guidance system initiated a series of high-speed, corkscrew maneuvers designed to defeat the intercept algorithms of the Aegis system. This was the nightmare scenario for any air defense officer. The white dots on the screen began to jitter and jump as the computer struggled to calculate a new intercept point for a target that refused to stay on a predictable path. The first SM-6 missed its mark by less than 50 meters, its proximity fuse failing to detonate because the closure rate was simply too high. The second interceptor attempted to compensate, its steering, fins glowing red-hot from the friction of the thinning atmosphere. It veered hard to the left, pulling 30 Gs of force, in a desperate attempt to stay on target. But the Khalij Fars was already through the first defensive layer. It had bypassed the long-range interceptors and was now entering the lower atmosphere, where the air was thick and its steering fins were most effective. The tactical action officer immediately called for a second volley, this time using the shorter-range Standard Missile 2, but time was no longer on their side. The threat was now less than 15 miles away and closing at 2 miles every second. 4:22 in the morning. The lower atmosphere above the Gulf of Oman was no longer empty. The Khalij Fars had survived the outer layer and was now screaming through the clouds at Mach 4. The air around the missile's nose cone had turned into a sheath of superheated plasma, glowing with a brilliant, predatory white light. Down on the surface, the USS John Finn was fighting for its life, the entire ship vibrating, as the steering gear slammed the rudder from side to side in a desperate, high-speed zigzag. The air on the deck was heavy, with the smell of scorched paint and the acrid residue of the first failed interceptors. The terminal phase of a ballistic missile attack is a blur of high-velocity physics, where seconds feel like hours. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer's hands were steady on his controls, but his jaw was locked tight. The Master 6014 track was now less than 10 miles out, its altitude dropping through 20,000 feet. The ship's ANSPY-6 radar was working in its highest frequency mode, pouring every kilowatt of power into a narrow beam to stay locked on the maneuvering warhead. The heat generated by the radar arrays was so intense that the cooling system's pumps were running at their absolute mechanical limit, a low-frequency whine echoing through the forward compartments. The second defensive layer was activated, the Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, or ESSM. 4 of the smaller, highly agile missiles ripped out of the Mark 41 vertical launch system in a rapid-fire sequence. They were launched at such short intervals that the smoke from the first had not cleared before the fourth was already airborne. These missiles were designed for this exact moment, the final, inner-tier defense against a target that had broken through the long-range screen. They climbed at a shallow angle, their rocket motors burning a bright, fierce violet against the dark horizon, heading for a collision point, just 5 miles from the ship's rail. But the Khalij Fars was no longer following a ballistic path. Its electro-optical seeker had locked onto the destroyer's massive thermal plume. The missile's internal computer recognized the shape of the DDG-113 and executed a final, violent, pitch-down maneuver. The sheer force of the turn caused the missile's airframe to groan under the stress, but it held. The first 2 Sea Sparrow missiles, expecting a more linear target, overshot the mark and self-destructed in a pair of harmless orange flashes 3 miles away. The third interceptor came within meters, its proximity fuse triggered by the missile's wake, but the shrapnel only shredded the Khalij Fars' rear fins, not enough to stop its momentum. On the bridge, the commanding officer looked out the reinforced glass and saw it a falling star that refused to burn out. The missile was now visible to the naked eye, a streak of white-hot light cutting through the humid night air. Brace for impact. The command was broadcast over the ship's 1MC circuit, the voice of the officer of the deck, crackling with an urgency that froze the blood of every sailor on board. Men in the engine rooms gripped whatever steel handhold they could find, tucking their chins and closing their eyes as they waited for the world to end. The air around the ship seemed to hum with the static electricity of the approaching warhead, a physical sensation that raised the hair on the back of every neck. The final line of defense, the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, or CIWS, roared to life on the aft superstructure. The 20mm Gatling gun began spitting out tungsten armor-piercing rounds at a rate of 75 shots per second. The sound was like a giant piece of canvas being torn in half. A mechanical scream that drowned out even the roar of the ship's engines. Tracer rounds streaked into the sky, a ladder of red light reaching out to catch the intruder. Bits of the missile's outer casing began to fly off as the tungsten rounds found their mark, but the mass of the warhead was too great to be deflected. The Khalij Fars was no longer flying. It was a 500-kilogram hammer of high explosives and kinetic energy, falling at 2,000 miles per hour, and it was now less than 1 second from the hull. 4:23 in the morning, the Gulf of Oman. The Khalij Fars missile completed its terminal dive, a screaming white-hot spear of kinetic energy and high explosives. The Phalanx Close-In Weapon System was still firing, its barrels glowing a dull cherry red when the warhead crossed the final 50 meters in the blink of an eye. There was no time for a second breath, no time for a final prayer. The air around the aft section of the ship was instantly superheated to thousands of degrees as the weapon made physical contact with the steel. The warhead punched straight through the aluminum alloy superstructure of the aft deckhouse, the kinetic energy alone shredding the thin metal, like wet paper. A millisecond later, the 500-kilogram high-explosive charge detonated deep inside the ship's interior. A massive fireball bleached the night sky white, a blinding flash that could be seen by merchant ships 50 miles away. The explosion drove a shockwave through the hull that sent a physical ripple through the steel plates, buckling the flight deck, and blowing the heavy hatches of the aft vertical launch system straight off their hinges. The impact was centered near the helicopter hangar and the auxiliary machinery room. The blast wave expanded at 6,000 meters per second, crushing every internal bulkhead in the aft third of the ship. In the machinery room, the high-pressure steam lines ruptured instantly, filling the compartment with a searing, invisible mist that cooked everything it touched. Sailors who were standing near the impact zone were thrown against the bulkheads with such force that their bones shattered before they even felt the heat. The ship didn't just rock. It was shoved violently to the side, the 3-meter swell of the Gulf of Oman suddenly feeling like a minor ripple compared to the mechanical violence of the strike. The destroyer's response was immediate and visceral. The stern of the ship dipped low into the water as the weight of the blast and the incoming flood of seawater began to pull at the hull. On the bridge, the impact felt like the ship had run full speed into a mountain of solid rock. Windows shattered, and the deck leapt upward, throwing Commander Vane and his bridge team into the air. The lights flickered, died, and then were replaced by the eerie, dim red glow of the emergency battle lanterns. The smell of the sea was gone, replaced instantly by the acrid, choking stench of burnt high explosives, vaporized hydraulic fluid, and the copper tang of blood. The fire erupted with a predatory roar, fed by the broken fuel lines of the ship's 2 helicopters in the hangar. A column of thick, oily black smoke began to pour from the gaping hole in the superstructure, rising hundreds of feet into the air. Below the waterline, the hull had been breached in at least 3 places where the shockwave had popped the rivets and split the weld seams. The ocean, cold and relentless, began to pour into the aft compartments at a rate of thousands of gallons per minute. The USS John Finn was no longer an apex predator of the seas. It was a wounded animal, bleeding fire and steel into the dark waters of the Gulf. The silence that followed the initial detonation lasted for exactly 2 seconds before it was replaced by the screaming of alarms and the frantic shouting of damage control teams. The ship's internal communications were shattered in the aft sections, leaving sailors to fight the rising water and the spreading fire in total isolation. The deck beneath their feet began to tilt perceptibly to the port side. a slow and terrifying roll that signaled the loss of stability. The heat from the hangar fire was so intense that the deck plates began to glow, and the paint on the bulkheads 2 compartments away began to blister and peel. The battle to save the ship had begun, but the wound was deep, and the sea was already claiming its prize. 4:25 in the morning. The USS John Finn was a scene of controlled chaos and industrial-grade horror. Inside the ship, the air was a thick, toxic soup of black smoke and the acrid, chemical bite of halon gas released by the automated fire suppression systems. Visibility in the passageways had dropped to 0, forcing sailors to feel their way along the bulkheads, their hands searing as they touched the heated steel. The smell of burning jet fuel from the ruptured helicopter tanks was everywhere, a heavy, oily scent that clung to skin and clothing. Despite the destruction, the damage control teams moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, their heavy boots clanking against the deck as they dragged fire hoses toward the inferno at the stern. In the aft machinery room, the situation was critical. The main engine room was still operational, but the secondary space was a nightmare of twisted metal and high-pressure steam. A fire party, led by a second-class damage controlman, attempted to enter the compartment, but they were pushed back by a wall of heat that melted the visors of their breathing apparatus. "Secure the fuel valves," a voice screamed over the roar of the fire, barely audible over the sound of seawater rushing into the hull. Through a 3-meter gash in the port side, the ship groaned, a deep, structural sound of metal under extreme stress as the weight of the water began to pull the stern deeper into the dark swells. The damage control officer in the central control station watched the liquid level indicators with growing dread. Compartments 7, 8, and 9 were already completely submerged, and the water was beginning to breach the transverse bulkheads. Every time the ship rolled to port, thousands of additional gallons of the Gulf of Oman poured into the shattered hull, making it harder for the ship to right itself. The electrical grid was flickering, the massive surges from short-circuiting equipment in the flooded sections threatening to knock out the remaining gas turbines. They were losing the battle against the physics of buoyancy, and the heat from the hangar fire was now so intense, it was threatening the structural integrity of the main mast. On the flight deck, the scene was illuminated by the flickering orange light of the burning helicopters. Sailors were using a Pone 100 portable pump to try and dewater the hangar, but the volume of the sea was simply too great. The fire had reached the ready service ammunition locker for the flight deck, and small arms rounds began to cook off, snapping like firecrackers in the heat. Each pop was a reminder that the ship was a floating magazine, and if the fire reached the Mark 41 vertical launch cells, the John Finn would be vaporized instantly. The air was filled with the sound of the wind whipping the smoke and the rhythmic, hollow thud of the sea, slamming against the wounded hull. Commander Vane stood in the center of the bridge, receiving reports through a sound-powered phone as the electronic internal comms continued to fail. His face was streaked with soot, and his hands were stained with the hydraulic fluid that had sprayed from the bridge's steering console. The report from the chief engineer was blunt. The ship had a 15-degree list to port, and the flooding was no longer contained. They had lost the auxiliary power units, and the main engines were being cooled by seawater that was becoming increasingly contaminated with debris and oil. The commander looked out at the dark horizon, knowing that every minute he kept the crew on board was a minute he was gambling with 300 lives. By 4:35, the fire in the hangar had been knocked down to a smolder, but the victory was hollow. The weight of the water used to fight the fire, combined with the thousands of tons of the Gulf now inside, the ship had reached a tipping point. The list increased to 18 degrees, and the stern was so low that the waves were now washing over the edge of the flight deck. The USS John Finn was no longer fighting back. It was merely enduring, a 10,000-ton island of steel that was slowly being swallowed by the very ocean it was meant to. Command. The order to prepare for a possible evacuation was whispered among the officers. A word that no one wanted to say, but everyone knew was coming. 4:40 in the morning. The structural integrity of the USS John Finn was failing in a slow, agonizing sequence of metallic screams. The internal bulkheads, designed to withstand the pressure of the deep, were buckling under the weight of nearly 4,000 tons of seawater that had surged into the aft compartments. A deep, rhythmic thud echoed through the ship every time a wave hit the port side, the sound of steel plates shearing away from their frames. The air in the remaining dry passageways was thick with the smell of wet insulation, burnt rubber, and the heavy, humid scent of a dying ship. Visibility was limited to the narrow, flickering beams of handheld flashlights, carried by the last damage control teams. The main engine room, the heart of the destroyer, was the final battleground. Water was now spraying through the overhead cable runs, a cold salt rain that short-circuited the remaining lighting panels. In a shower of blue sparks, the chief engineer stood on the upper grating, watching as the dark, oily water rose toward the lower bearings of the gas turbine engines. The heat from the engines, still running at a low idle to maintain electrical power, combined with the rising water to create a thick, suffocating fog. Every few seconds, the ship would groan a sound like a freight train, braking as the hull twisted under the asymmetrical weight of the flood. The moment of catastrophic failure occurred at 4:45. The transverse bulkhead between the auxiliary machinery room and the main engine room, weakened by the initial missile blast, finally gave way. 10 tons of steel plate snapped like a brittle wafer, and a wall of seawater 3 meters high surged into the engine room. The sound was a deafening roar that swallowed the screams of the alarms and the whine of the turbines. As the water hit the hot engine casings, it erupted into a massive cloud of white steam, instantly blinding everyone in the space and raising the temperature to levels that the sailors' flash gear could no longer repel. The main engines flared, coughed, and then died as the salt water was sucked into the air intakes. In an instant, the ship lost all propulsion and all primary electrical power. The steady hum that had defined the life of the vessel for years was replaced by an absolute, terrifying silence, broken only by the sound of water rushing into the void. The John Finn was now dead in the water, a term that carried the literal weight of a death sentence, in the middle of a combat zone. The list to port increased sharply from 18 degrees to 25 degrees, making it impossible for sailors to stand on the deck without holding onto the railings. On the bridge, the loss of power was the final signal. The digital displays went black, and the glowing icons of the Aegis system vanished, leaving the bridge team in the dim, red glow of the emergency lanterns. The ship felt heavy, sluggish, and unresponsive, less like a vessel, and more like a sinking rock. The horizon outside the bridge windows was no longer level. The portside windows were now looking directly into the black waves of the Gulf. Commander Vane felt the shudder through the deck plates and knew the main girder of the ship had likely snapped. The structural failure was now visible on the weather decks. The flight deck had developed a massive fracture that ran from the port rail to the center of the ship, the steel curling upward as if peeled by a giant hand. The mast, stripped of its radar arrays by the shockwave, leaned at an unnatural angle toward the stern. Every time the ship rolled, more of the Gulf poured over the side, the weight of the water accelerating the descent. The USS John Finn was no longer a platform for war. It was a collection of 300 human beings trapped inside a collapsing steel tomb, and the sea was finishing what the missile had started. 4:50 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman. The USS John Finn was tilted at a permanent 30-degree list to port, its stern already entirely submerged beneath the dark, white-capped swells. The sound of the ship was no longer mechanical. It was the sound of a living thing dying, the screech of tearing metal, the hollow boom of trapped air escaping, and the relentless rush of the sea. The air was freezing, chilled by the spray of the ocean and the loss of all internal heating, and it carried the heavy, suffocating smell of diesel fuel and burnt electronics. Commander Vane stood on the high side of the bridge, his boots braced against the deck-to-bulkhead seam to keep from sliding into the rising water. The decision was not a choice, but a recognition of physical reality. All hands, abandon ship. Vane commanded into the battery-powered megaphone, his voice carrying across the silent, darkened bridge. The order was repeated manually through the passageways by petty officers using whistles and shouted commands. There was no panic, only the grim, methodical execution of 1,000 hours of training. Sailors emerged from the hatches in small groups, their orange life vests glowing like embers in the dim light of the emergency chem lights they had cracked and tucked into their gear. The evacuation was a nightmare of physics and slippery steel. Because of the severe list, the lifeboats on the starboard side were hanging over the deck, while the lifeboats on the port side were already partially underwater. Sailors had to slide down the angled hull, using ropes and fire hoses to control their descent into the black water. The Gulf was 68 degrees cold enough to steal the breath from a man's lungs the moment he hit the surface. The smell of the oil slick on the water's surface was overwhelming, a thick chemical coating that made every movement a struggle against a greasy, suffocating film. On the flight deck, the last of the wounded were being lowered into the rigid hull inflatable boats. One sailor, his legs broken by the initial blast, was strapped into a Stokes litter and lowered carefully by his shipmates as the deck beneath them shuddered with every passing wave. The light from the still smoldering hangar fire provided a flickering, hellish illumination for the scene, casting long, dancing shadows across the water. As each raft cleared the side of the ship, the sailors paddled frantically to move away from the hull, fearing the suction that would occur when the 10,000-ton vessel finally made its plunge. The commanding officer was the last to leave the bridge. He took one final look at the darkened consoles of the Aegis system, the silent screens that had once been the most advanced eyes in the world. He moved toward the starboard bridge wing, the highest point of the ship, and stepped over the railing, onto the side of the hull. The steel was cold and slick with sea salt, hitting the water with a sharp, icy shock that seemed to compress his chest. When he surfaced, he looked back and saw the bow of the USS John Finn sticking straight up into the air like a jagged tombstone. 300 sailors were now scattered across the dark water in a cluster of orange rafts and individual life rings. The silence was absolute, save for the splashing of water and the occasional, distant shout of a squad leader counting heads. The heat of the ship was gone, replaced by the vast, indifferent cold of the open sea. The air was clear now, the smoke having drifted away, leaving only the sharp smell of salt and the faint, fading scent of the ship's last breath. The crew watched in a unified, hollow silence as the last of the air escaped the forward compartments with a sound like a long, tired sigh. 5:15 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman, 40 miles off the Iranian coast. The search and rescue aircraft of Carrier Strike Group 11 were already on station before the last of the destroyer's bow disappeared. An E-2 Charlie Hawkeye circled at 20,000 feet, its massive radar dome acting as the digital conductor for the rescue operation. Below the clouds, two MH-60 Sierra helicopters from the USS Gerald R. Ford hovered over the debris field, their powerful searchlights cutting through the gray morning mist. The air was cold and whipped into a frenzy by the helicopter rotors, smelling of salt spray, burnt carbon, and the heavy, sweet scent of aviation fuel. The rescue was a race against the current and the looming threat of further escalation. The Iranian coastal batteries remained active, their radars painting the rescue helicopters with intermittent pulses of energy. But the presence of a full carrier strike group over the horizon provided a tense, unspoken shield. The USS Mason, a sister destroyer, was the first surface vessel to arrive. On the scene, its hull cutting through the oil-slicked water at 30 knots, the crew of the Mason stood at the rails, with cargo nets and life rings, their eyes searching the dark swells for the telltale orange of the USS John Finn's life rafts. The first group of survivors was winched up from a crowded raft by the lead helicopter. The sailors were soaked to the bone, their skin a pale, ghostly blue from the early stages of hypothermia. As they were pulled into the cabin of the Seahawk, they were wrapped in wool blankets and given warm water, their eyes wide and staring as they processed the loss of their ship. The smell inside the helicopter was a mix of sweat, sea salt, and the sterile scent of medical supplies. The crew chief moved, among them, checking for injuries and shouting encouragement over the deafening roar of the twin engines. By 5:45, the sun began to peak over the eastern horizon, revealing the true scale of the disaster. A massive oil slick, nearly 2 miles long, stretched across the water, shimmering with a rainbow-colored sheen under the morning light. Fragments of the ship, charred pieces of the helicopter hangar, life rings, and hundreds of floating acoustic tiles bobbed in the waves like the remains of a broken toy. There was no sign of the USS John Finn itself. The 10,000-ton vessel had settled on the seabed over 300 meters below. The USS Mason deployed its small boats to recover the remaining sailors scattered across the debris field. Commander Vane was pulled from the water at 6 in the morning, his uniform heavy with oil and salt. He refused medical attention until he had confirmed the count of his crew. Of the 310 personnel on board, 298 were accounted for. 12 remained missing, presumed lost in the initial blast or trapped within the aft machinery spaces when the bulkheads gave way. The silence on the deck of the Mason was absolute as the final count was reported a professional, heavy grief that no one dared to voice aloud. As the last of the survivors were brought on board the rescue vessels, the carrier strike group began to reposition. The FA-18 fighters that had been providing top cover banked hard to the west, their afterburners glowing like small suns against the pale morning sky. The mission had shifted from a combat engagement to a recovery and salvage operation, but the tension in the region had reached a boiling point. The Gulf of Oman was quiet again, the only sound being the rhythmic slapping of waves against the rescue boats. But the empty space on the horizon, where a billion-dollar destroyer had once stood, was a silent, terrifying testament to the lethality of the new age of naval warfare. 6 in the evening on the 18th of March, 2026. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The loss of the USS John Finn was no longer a frantic tactical problem, but a cold, analytical entry in a strategic report. Inside the secure briefing room, the air was still and smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the salt and fire of the Gulf. On the stop, high-resolution displays, a three-dimensional reconstruction of the engagement played in a continuous, silent loop. The technical experts from Naval Sea Systems Command and the Office of Naval Intelligence sat in high-back chairs, their faces illuminated by the blue light of the data. The formal investigation, documented in Style At2, began with the failure of the Aegis Baseline 10 intercept sequence. Analysis of the recovered telemetry data from the USS Mason showed that the Khalij Fars missile had utilized a previously unobserved frequency-hopping seeker during its terminal phase. This electronic countermeasure had created a momentary ghosting effect on the destroyer's ANSPY-6 radar, delaying the final Sea Sparrow engagement by exactly 1.4 seconds. In a world measured in Mach numbers, those 1400 milliseconds were the difference between a successful intercept and the loss of $1 billion asset. The casualty report was finalized with the names of the 12 missing sailors now officially changed to "killed in action." The report noted that the structural failure of the hull had occurred faster than the design specifications of the SPEST Arleigh Burke-class had predicted. The kinetic energy of a ballistic impact, as opposed to the lateral blast of a cruise missile, had caused a longitudinal fracture along the ship's main keel. Future procurement plans were immediately adjusted, with the Navy Department calling for an emergency upgrade to the deck armor and shock hardening of all active-duty destroyers in the region. At Naval Station Mayport, the families of the crew were gathered in a private auditorium, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and the muffled sound of sobbing. The survivors of the John Finn sat together in the front rows, their new uniforms looking stiff and out of place on bodies that still felt the phantom roll of a sinking deck. Commander Vane stood at the podium, his voice cracking only once as he read the names of the 12 who had stayed with the ship. The sense of loss was physical. a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room, reminding them that the cost of maritime dominance was paid in more than just taxpayer dollars. Strategically, the sinking of a United States destroyer had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Middle East. The Gulf of Oman was declared a high-threat zone, and the Fifth Fleet was reinforced with 2 additional carrier strike groups. The Iranian government celebrated the event as a victory for their anti-access and area denial strategy, while the United States began a systematic campaign of cyber and electronic retaliation. The Gulf incident became the primary case study for a new generation of naval officers, a brutal lesson in the lethality of land-based ballistic missiles against surface combatants. The final entry in the official report focused on the salvage operation, which was ultimately abandoned due to the depth of the wreck and the proximity to hostile waters. The USS John Finn remains at the bottom of the Gulf of Oman, at coordinates 24 degrees 42 minutes north, 58 degrees 12 minutes east. The ship is now a silent, steel reef, its hull slowly being claimed by the pressure and the salt of the deep. The report concluded with a single, professional observation. The crew had performed their duties with the highest level of competence, and the loss was the result of a technical overmatch, not a human failure. The era of the untouchable American destroyer had ended in a flash of orange flame and a long, cold slide into the dark.